Hello, BookTube. Well, despite all the stuff that I've got going on here, and despite the fact that the light is fading, I couldn't let the day go by without a poem. Because it is Poetry Thursday, after all. The smallest and most despised BookTube ritual of them all, where you take a poem off the shelf and read it to us, and maybe talk about it a little if you want. You don't have to. You can just read the poem. I like it. I think it's a wonderful grace note on BookTube, a gigantic, sprawling ecosystem of book appreciation that somehow manages not to appreciate poetry. So I thought I would do that for today. It doesn't have to be that long. And I went to the source. I went to one of the greatest poetry anthologies ever done, the Oxford Book of English Verse, which has had many incarnations. The famous one from Rumpole of the Bailey is the Quiller Cooch edition. The Quiller Cooch edition was very idiosyncratic. It was very much a Quiller Cooch production. Whereas it wasn't, in other words, a representative anthology. It didn't try to give you an idea of all of the course of English poetry. Instead, it was kind of his favorites. It was updated by the great Helen Gardner into the anthology I think it was always meant to be. So I went straight to this. I don't even have a copy of the Quiller Cooch. And I picked a poem by Robert Graves, who a lot of you will know mostly as the author of I, Claudius and Claudius the God, or maybe even the Greek myths. He has huge works of prose to his credit, fiction and nonfiction. I know it's heretical, but I have always thought that he is a better poet than he is a prose writer. His poetry is completely out of fashion now. It is metrical. It scans. It usually has rhymes of some kind or another, and that is totally gone. And I don't think it's ever coming back because it takes work to do. You can make a whole career out of yourself, read your poem at the presidential inauguration without work. Why would you work? So I don't think those are ever coming back. But I found one of his poems that I wanted to read to you. It's called Full Moon, and it goes like this. As I walked out that sultry night, I heard the stroke of one. The moon, attained to her full height, stood beaming like the sun. She exorcised the ghostly wheat to mute assent in love's defeat, whose tryst had now begun. The fields lay sick beneath my tread, a tedious owlet cried, a nightingale above my head with this or that replied, like man or wife who nightly keep inconsequent debate in sleep as they dream side by side. Your phantom wore the moon's cold mask, my phantom wore the same, forgetful of the feverish task in hope of which they came. Each image held the other's eyes and watched a gray distraction rise to cloud the eager flame. To cloud the eager flame of love, to fog the shining gate. They held the tyrannous queen above, sole mover of their fate. Tyrannous queen being the moon. They glared at marble statues glare across the tessellated stair or down the halls of state. And now warm earth was Arctic sea. Each breath came dagger keen. Two bergs of glinting ice were we. The broad moon sailed between. There swam the mermaids, tailed and fin, and love went by upon the wind as though it had not been. So we start out with, I walked out on a sultry night. We start out on a warm note. And the narrator in the poem starts to talk about the moon and the voices of birds at night that you can hear. And we start to think maybe that this is a conventional nature-driven love poem. But what do we hear about the calls of the birds? We hear, first of all, the phrase love's defeat crops up in the first stanza. Starts to ring a note that we're not expecting. And what do we hear about the birds' calls? A baby owl is calling, and so is a nightingale, but they're not talking to each other. They are engaged in the inconsequent debate in sleep that married folk have, that man and wife have. So by the end of the second stanza, we know perfectly well this is not a love poem. This is an out-of-love poem. And that's what we get at the end, that image of icebergs passing each other by. That the earth, the warm earth, has become freezing cold because love is gone. There is nothing here. The narrator is talking to someone. Your phantom wore the moon's cold mask. My phantom wore the same. There's another person in this poem. But if there was love there once, it is gone. It is the Arctic now. It is two icebergs passing each other in the dark. An amazing set of imageries here to describe. The title of the poem is Full Moon. It's very innocuous, but what's being described here is a very cold and complete cessation of love. Two marble statues looking at each other just by chance in the hall room. They might be looking at each other, but there is nothing between them. They are dead to each other. They are dead completely. I think that's very fascinating. As with so many of these poems that I pick for you, including this one by Robert Graves, I often wonder what prompted this. Right? It starts out with the appurtenances and some of the language of typical nature-driven love poetry, but it is not that. It is much bleaker than that. Why? What was Graves thinking when he did this? Was it just the metrics? You could sense when I read it there, even the job that I did, you can hear some of the buried rhymes in there and some of the explicit ones. Was it just that? Is that what he wanted to do? Or did he have was there something driving this poem? Who is the you? I don't know. It's been a long time since I read a Robert Graves biography. Maybe I should do that. There are quite a few of them, a dozen to choose from, so maybe I should. But anyway, that is our poem for today, Full Moon, Robert Graves, from the Oxford Book of English Verse. See, these Thursday poetry videos don't have to be long at all. So I'm going to wrap this up for now, and I'll see you next Thursday with another poem. So it's as easy as that. I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.